I will stick around for a little bit afterwards, depending on what the score of the game is. I actually just told Marcy, I'm actually a diehard Buckeyes fan, and if this had been scheduled the wrong way, I probably wouldn't have been here. I'd like to think I'm generous, but not quite so generous to give up my Buckeyes. But anyways, my name is Arun Panasamy, and I am a private college counselor with a company called CollegeWise. I know a few of you in here know us already because you're already working with us, but we're basically a group of about 30 plus counselors around the United States who work with high school students and their parents on the college application process. I'm actually the head counselor at CollegeWise, so I support and advise the other 30-some counselors on with the students they're working with. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I feel like on a night like tonight, I'm drawing as much on my counseling experience, and I've been a counselor now for about 12 years, but prior to that, I actually was an admissions officer. I was one of those people on the other side who was helping make decisions, yes, no, maybe, let's give that student a full ride. And so I'm coming in with a lot of the insight from that experience. In particular, I started off in admissions at my alma mater, the University of Chicago. If any of you are familiar with it, where fun goes to die, is the joke. I personally loved it. I know it wasn't for everyone. And so I spent 5 years there working admissions. It was probably the coolest job to have right out of college. You know, I had a wonderful experience at the University of Chicago, and they handed me an Amex and said, all right, travel around and tell people how much you loved it, right? And after that, I ended up working in the admissions office of another party school, Caltech, if you've heard of that, in Pasadena. And then I spent several years reading applications at UCLA as well. So I feel pretty one of my colleagues calculated a few years ago, and I think I've read about 20,000 college essays, about 8,000 apps, so I feel pretty comfortable saying I understand that process. And so I want to peel a little bit back on not just the process, but some of the thinking, some of the kind of the larger structure surrounding college admissions. And then I also want to share a little bit of what we were looking for in those applications. And I'm hoping that will help drive like good behavior and some good decision making as you guys start. You're going to continue to be faced with decisions in the coming weeks and months and years, and hopefully it'll give you a little bit more information to base a lot of those on. Before I dive in any further, I am curious to know who's in the room. So perhaps by a show of hands, whether you are a junior or the parent of a junior, could you raise your hand? So 11th graders, these are juniors. Okay, that's half here. What about sophomores, 10th graders? Okay, good contingent. Any freshmen? Awesome. I think it's good to get out early. I used to say it's never too early to get out, but I did this last year. I was speaking at a high school last January, actually, and there was a mom who had her second grader there. So that does feel too early to me. 9th grade, 8th grade, that's a nice sweet spot. Are there any seniors who are lost in here? We should, okay, good, because it would feel a little bit late for you guys. So anyways, good, I know who's in the room, and I'm gonna go ahead and kind of dive in here. You know, one of the, I've just finished working with our group of seniors, all of our counselors have, and we're able to kind of take a look at like who actually enjoyed this process versus who got overwhelmed by it, who found themselves stressed out, pulling the hair out, who found themselves in a situation where the students and the parents were constantly arguing, and if not arguing, were at odds with each other. And to those of us at CollegeWise, we really feel like the healthy process starts with a good, balanced college list. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but what we often find, the first time we meet with a family who shows up in our office, I shouldn't say often, but sometimes, enough that we notice it, a student will show up, parents will show up in our office, and we'll ask them, so, where do you think you're applying to college? and the student will say something like, well, you know, I have straight A's and I have strong test scores, so I'm applying to all the Ivy League schools. Like, oh, okay. You know, I get it, you're ambitious, you're hardworking, but it also, to those of us who are college counselors, it tells us you have no clue of what you're doing. That right there is what we would consider an unbalanced list. Like, you don't know exactly why those schools are on your list. And so what we're really trying to aim for, the students that we see being happy and successful with this process, are the ones who go ahead and listen to the kind of advice provide on a night like tonight, or other evenings or ways of information your counselors provide you, and create that list of colleges that ultimately, yes, it has those dream schools, those impossible, hard to get into schools, but also has some schools where you're just kind of like, oh, I'd be thrilled to be here, and I'm almost certain that I'm going to get in. And I'm going to be talking a lot more about how you go about building a smart, balanced, thoughtful list as well. But before I go too far into that, on a night like tonight where I have a lot of parents in the audience, I think it's important to highlight how different this process is. I can tell you, living in Los Angeles, I'll talk to students about, we'll be talking about the UCs, and hey, you should apply to this UC or that UC, and LA parents will say, but no Santa Barbara, that's a party school, right? To a college counselor like myself, yes, I get the reputation, but at the same time, I also know that they have more Nobel Prize winners in recent years than like UCLA and Berkeley put together. It's a serious place where you can do serious learning. Similarly, if I bring up a school like Riverside, which, parents think I'm like banishing their children to the desert in a quite literal way. If I bring up Riverside, you're kind of failing to acknowledge that, if you take a look at US News and World Report, which I don't recommend building your list off of, it ends up in the top 80, I mean, it's a highly regarded school in a lot of ways. They're doing groundbreaking research. If we talk about being pre-med, they put more students in proportionally to medical schools than either San Diego, Berkeley, or LA. So even within the UCs, this little microcosm, there are a lot of assumptions made. A lot of those assumptions are made by parents. The process has changed, and it's not because students are smarter, I mean, it's not a case where they're like working harder and things of that sort, but just a lot of different factors. And one way I love to kind of highlight this is something that I've been learning more about myself, and that's just the rise of social media in the application process. Next slide. Yeah. Actually, this was a slide I should have had up a few minutes ago, but balanced and unbalanced. So next slide. I forgot that I'm not clicking through. Over here. So I always have this sense of Instagram being like all my friends and neighbors constantly taking pictures of the picnics and concerts we go to. But here you can see Vassar College using it to provide valuable information. And this actually is from last year, where I had a student who, she was all about Vassar, a small liberal arts college about 45 minutes to an hour outside of New York City. Vassar, Vassar, Vassar. And I just remember there was a day that she sent me this link. She's like, I don't know if Vassar's at the top of my list anymore, right? She's growing up in LA, didn't quite feel like it could be a good fit. And so this is something that years ago you can't even imagine a college sharing information, an admissions office sharing honest information this way. Next slide. You can actually even click on the picture. So this is from the University of Michigan, which is hard for me to say as a Buckeye fan, but I know my students well enough that this is something that one of my students sent me last year as well. And he was like, oh, look how cool this is. And it's just, I don't quite get what Vine is about. They're 6-second clips, but colleges are using this as part of their admissions process. Apparently that somehow resonates with 17 and 18-year-olds.
I don't have QuickTime, so.
Oh, you don't? Okay, got it. It's just a guy feeding a squirrel. So, next slide. Yeah, so Pinterest. Becoming familiar with this in the process of planning my own wedding, and I'm kind of shocked to learn that there are colleges who use Pinterest to talk more about themselves. And I think some of the stereotypes that hold for it being just about shopping, no, you have Yale University, one of the great institutions in the world, using Pinterest to help students get a better sense of who they are. Next slide. Twitter, which I'm not sure any of us have quite figured out how to use. But Twitter, this is actually a clip. I know no one can actually see what it says there, so I'll kind of explain. But it wasn't last year, but the year before, there was a young woman who was admitted to Lehigh University and Lafayette College, two schools in kind of eastern Pennsylvania that in a lot of ways seem pretty similar. And she was struggling, like many students do in that month of April, to kind of know Lehigh, Lafayette. And so she did something that to an admissions officer like me is kind of unheard of. And I say that because one of my jobs, for example, at Caltech, I was part of the publications team, which meant finding the perfect balance demographically of students to take a picture under a tree while they're reading poetry and kids in the background are playing frisbee or playing hacky sack, you know. We were very careful at kind of, controlling our image in a lot of ways. We only wanted students to have exactly the information we wanted them to have. And beyond that, presenting students information was very unidirectional. We told them exactly, here's how it flows. We give you what we want you to know. And this girl remarkably goes on Twitter and basically tags Lehigh and Lafayette and says, I'm into both of them. You guys, tell me why I should come to your school. Which to me is just audacious. I'm like, what? You know, you're lucky to get into both schools. But no, that's not how she should feel. They're lucky to get her. And so what ends up ensuing then is this amazing email exchange where professors from those colleges dove in. Students from the marching band, she was a girl who played an instrument and wanted to be part of a marching band. They dove in talking about why she should join their marching band. A local sandwich shop told them how much better their sandwiches at Lehigh are than the ones at Lafayette. And by the end of this fascinating thread, which we were all watching from afar, she kind of settles in and says, yeah, I think I have the information I need. I'll be a member of Lehigh's fall class, right? And so it's kind of amazing, these traditional ways of reading just, a book or just doing a campus visit have been augmented by all these other ways in which the process can become quite personal. Next one. This is probably a perfect example of not being able to control your own information. This is actually the Snapchat feed, off a Snapchat feed of a kid who loves NYU and kind of works tangentially alongside the admissions office, but after New York City murderless streak ends at 6, or I think it was 12 days, he writes, well, we tried. And this is going out to all these students, right? I worked at the University of Chicago, and this is slightly embarrassing to admit, but the day before we had a prospective students weekend, there was someone who was killed a couple blocks away from campus. And I remember us calling a meeting, trying to figure out, like, hey, are there any students who are part of the newspaper? Can we convince them not to publish that as a headline tomorrow? Because that's the day that 2,000 kids come onto campus to learn more about us, right? Those days are long gone with the way information is presented to students. So we can go on to the next slide. And so this is something I really want to kind of highlight. I think of myself as educators, and I know, as an educator, I know that your counselors in the back, that they're educators as well. But I think we'd all be doing you a disservice if we didn't talk about the fact that this entire admissions process exists within a very large business. Last year, the largest kind of proprietor of student information, a company called Royal, they sold for $800 million. They have the data kind of linking students' kind of behaviors, what they buy, what they want to study, to like test scores, and they can massage and manipulate that, and then provide that to colleges to let them make decisions. One of my jobs at Caltech, I was in charge of what was called student search. And through student search, I would be able to say, you know what, we really seem to be lacking for students from the Midwest the past 3 years. And I could contact the SAT, the College Board, the people who run the SAT, and I could contact the ACT, and I could say, listen, we're looking for more students from the Midwest. What can you do? And then they would make recommendations, and I could take a look, and I could buy every student within certain zip codes who had scored a 720 on the Math 2 subject test or a 5 on the Calculus VC test. I could buy those names, And then I could mail a brochure directly to those students telling them, hey, we hope you consider Caltech. And for that privilege, you can see, I would pay 37 cents a name through College Board, and then ACT values you slightly higher at 38 cents, right? But this is very much, so when you get those letters, and you guys, I know you're getting your PSATs slowly, those of you who are sophomores and juniors, has been a mini debacle, I guess, but it's sorting itself out. And you're getting your PSAT scores, and the other thing that's gonna happen is in a few weeks, in a few months, you're gonna start getting letters. And they're gonna be really personal sounding letters from the Director of Admissions at USC, and at Loyola Marymount, and Duke. But I'm going to tell you, not to break your hearts, but they're automatically mass generated in like kind of a printing shipping house, right? Where there are people like me who are going through saying, this is what we want, let's buy up these names and let's mail them letters and see if they can get interested, right? I think I have no problem with that process. I think it's a great way to get introduced to schools you've never heard of. I can tell you myself, I grew up in rural Ohio, you can probably tell, small farm town in Ohio, and I still remember to this day the very first piece of mail I got was in the dead winter of an Ohio winter, and it was Pepperdine University. And the pictures were of kids in like swimsuits on the beach playing volleyball, and I was like, this is my #1 choice, right? And then I started getting more letters, and I was like, okay, I probably should focus on other things. But no, 16 years later, I did find my way to Los Angeles, so it clearly held some deep sway. Next slide. And so we now find ourselves kind of in a place where, you know, with the cost of college educations and the kind of world that, you know, certainly I take this slide out in certain places, but I want to acknowledge, you know, we're in Southern California, Santa Barbara, you know what LA is like, you know what Beverly Hills can be like. And like so many other things kind of in our lives, even education, there are some folks who tend to commoditize it and make it kind of into a product. And then it becomes kind of a brand name, like, oh, what would be a cool bumper sticker on the back of mom and dad's minivan? Or, man, I'd love to be able to rock that sweatshirt on May 1st when everyone else is announcing which colleges they go to. And I'm pretty comfortable saying that is the absolute wrong way to go about thinking about how to build a college list. What might be great for one student isn't wonderful for another student at all. You know, college-wise, we're the kind of place that really talks about helping students find the school that makes sense for them. And I love celebrating the student. You know, a few years ago, I had a student who got into UCLA, and even more impressively, when you talk about selectivity, got into Stanford. And he took a lot of time to think about UCLA, Stanford, UCLA, Stanford. But he went ahead and visited all his colleges, and where did he end up? UC Santa Barbara. Because after all his research for what his particular academic interests were, that's what made sense. I got terrifying calls from his grandparents saying, what are you doing letting go Santa? I'm like, it's not my decision, you know, but that was a kid who looked beyond just the status that a UCLA or Stanford would to go, hey, this is what, you know, this is what I myself need in order to be successful. So, next slide. Next one. So I know a lot of the conversation about college admissions centers around how impossible it is to get into college. You know, there's so much, I know, chatter about college admissions. I feel like every time I open up a New York Times or USA Today, or frankly, anytime I go to a party in Los Angeles, a barbecue or a cocktail party, I remember like 10 or 12 years ago, people would ask me what I did, and I would tell them, oh, I'm a college counselor, and you could see the blood drain out of them, like, oh my God, I'm stuck with the most boring person in the room. Well, there's all these directors and actors, you know, around me. Now all their kids are like 13, 14, 15, and I'm kind of the most important person they know. And so, one of the things I really want to kind of beat down is the idea that it's impossible to go to college. It's impossible to get in, because I think that framework can be really destructive when you're thinking about figuring out ways to allow this process to be enjoyable. And so if you look at the upper left kind of quadrant over there, what we're seeing right over there, we are seeing when we're looking at the four-year universities in the United States, what the rate of selectivity is. So to the far, far left, that tiny blue strip, that represents about 12, 15 schools that admit 12.5% or fewer of their students. The next band over is about another 40 schools that admits about 20% or less of their students. And so you've got only about 60 schools that admit less than 25% of their students. And then even that green bar over there is just 50% or less. So the vast majority of students go to colleges. The kids in the red and in the purple, the vast majority go to colleges that are admitting the vast majority of their students. And these aren't just other people's kids, right? These are great schools that are doing great things. You know, something that I like doing every few years is I go through, you've heard of Fortune magazine. They go through and they pull out the Fortune 500 CEOs. So the chief executive officers of the 500 most powerful companies in the world. And I take a look at the top 100. And I like to look at where did they spend their undergraduate years. And I must admit, every year I'm surprised. And that's because the usual suspects aren't there. In fact, when I did it 2 years ago, there were two colleges at the top. Can anyone guess which they were? You can just kind of yell it out. Harvard. So Harvard was one of the two schools at the top. Anyone else have a guess? You probably would have had to heard me talk about this last year to remember this. But the University of Wisconsin at Madison, right? That's the flagship university for that state. It's kind of like their Berkeley. And what I found in that 100, half the Ivy League schools did not show up. You know who did show up? Cal State University, Northridge. Also, Biola. How many of you have heard of Biola? A couple of you have? All right, you're going to church, good. That's the Bible Institute of Los Angeles. That showed up there, half the Ivies didn't. So this idea that like where you go is going to automatically launch you in a certain direction is just not true. And again, this isn't something that I'm coming at from some sort of moral, perspective or ethical perspective. It's really, I want you to kind of keep this in mind as we dive in a little bit deeper about creating that smart college list, because the students, the parents, who start to understand what that larger landscape looks like, they're the ones who end up being more successful in this process. The ones who kind of continue to think only that the blue and the orange schools are the ones that set students up for success, well, that ends up getting reflected in interesting ways throughout the application process, and ultimately not in the, ultimately with not the best results. So, next page. I'd be the last person to kind of argue that how much money you make should determine how happy you are, or why you should pick a college. But this is taking a look at data from payscale.com. They're a website that goes through and takes a look and kind of plays around with pay scales in all sorts of different ways. And so here's a look at full-time with 10 years of experience in a field coming out of what colleges, how much the students make. So you see Princeton University right there at the top, an Ivy League school. Okay, great, your mind's not blown. Harvey Mudd College, great small math science college about an hour outside of Los Angeles. Some of you wouldn't have heard of that. Caltech, okay, great, you're familiar with that. The Naval Academy, West Point, again, feels like those guys and those men and women deserve exactly that, if not more. But then how many of you have heard of Lehigh? Yeah, I mentioned a little bit earlier, right? Small university, great engineering school, also has a business school affiliated with it. And so a lot of their students end up doing kind of double majors or end up minoring in one or the other, and so they get this great technical education as well as the business education. Ends up being a situation where they're highly sought after at a lot of tech companies in New York City and Boston, and as a result they fare really well on the job market. Babson College, a small business-only college, probably the best undergraduate entrepreneurship program in the United States. Again, not something that pops into your mind. You might think Wharton or NYU Stern or whatever it might be. And there's Babson College out in, in the kind of suburbs of Boston. NYU, and then some school you've barely heard of, at number 10 spot. Next slide. And I think this is always actually this one is always a bit of fun here. If you just look at the 13th slot, you've got Dartmouth and Harvard, 2 Ivy League schools. You've got Notre Dame, probably the most selective of the, elite Catholic universities. And then you have Colgate. Most of us don't think of a school when we hear Colgate, right? And there it is stacked up against those heavyweights. And you can kind of go on and down through the list. And, I always have, after I do a session like this, I often always have like one parent who comes up like, listen, we heard what you said, but our child, well, he wants to become an artist. And you can see these like visions of like, which means you'll never have a job and you'll live in our basement the rest of his life, right? And I love there at 65, ahead of UCLA is California College of the Arts, kind of the Oakland area. They do an amazing job getting artistic, creative students to also get the kind of skills that will allow them to get real great high-paying jobs as well. And so again, like a lot of the assumptions that you might have about a particular school or particular track get upended once you start looking deeper and deeper into the data. What does matter, no surprise for those of you who are already in that world, the degrees that degrees matter, what you major in. You can see these engineering, STEM related fields. If all you care about is making money, you should definitely go to the University of Tulsa and become a petrochemical engineering major, because you're going to do just fine. You'll probably be living in the desert someplace, but you'll do just fine. Next page. And I'll use this kind of as a last example. Part of, working at a place like Caltech is amazing. It was the kind of place that on 2 occasions when I was at the faculty club, someone bumped into my chair. And when I turned around to go, excuse me, why aren't you apologizing? It's Stephen Hawking trying to get by in his wheelchair, right? Like it's that kind of place. And so part of my job as an admissions officer would be to go around, travel the country, and set myself up at college fairs, in cafeterias and gymnasiums, not much different than this, and tell students about what a wonderful place that Caltech was. And I was good at that job. I loved it. I mean, Caltech was a place I believed in. Like even as someone who barely got through calculus in college, I have tremendous respect for science. I believe it's what's going to save us in a lot of ways. And I love talking about what a remarkable place it is. As an undergraduate student, you can work with a Nobel Prize winning professor. Within half an hour, you get to do all this amazing mountain biking in the St. Gabriel's. Within an hour, if there's no traffic, you can be at the ocean surfing. There's always traffic, by the way, which is why you guys live in Santa Barbara, probably. I could go on and on about what a great place Caltech was. And I would develop, as an admissions officer, relationships with these students, get to really know them. And I remember it was close towards the end of my tenure there, part of the tipping point, taking a call from a student who had this idea. He called me and he was sobbing. And he was just like, Mr. Arun, I can't believe I didn't get into Caltech. I can't believe you guys turned me down. I listened to all your advice, and I did what you said to do in the classroom. I did what you said to do outside of the classroom. How could you guys turn me down? And he goes through and he tells everything he's done, and I'm like, whoa, this kid is impressive, right? At the same time, being mindful of the fact that Caltech is a very selective place. My final year, we admitted about 13% of the students. My final year in we required the Math 2 subject test, which is the higher level subject test, and it gets scored between 200 and 800. And we required it, and an 800 is perfect. And our middle 50 percentile on the students we admitted was a 790 to an 800. That was the level of student we admitted at Caltech. But I was like, oh, man, did I make a mistake? And this kid is just sobbing. And then he tells me, he's like, yeah, and now I'm going to be stuck studying physics at either Berkeley or Columbia, right? And to an extent, I was like, dude, what's wrong with you? But I also thought about for the past 2.5 years, he's heard people like me say how amazing Caltech is, and he got in his head that that's where he had to study physics. So I remember coming across this data, and in this bottom right, this is basically taking a look at proportionally, where do students who get PhDs in certain disciplines, where do they spend their undergraduate years? So if we look at the one in physical sciences, number 1, Caltech. No surprise. Number 2, MIT. Number 3, Reed College. How many of you have heard of Reed? Okay, handful of you. Reed is the small liberal arts college located in Portland. And it also has, interestingly enough, the only undergraduate run nuclear reactor on a college campus, right? I have no idea how, remembering what I was like at 18 and even 21, I have no idea how you could put students in charge of a nuclear reactor, but they do at Reed College. But what you have is this environment, Portland being a highly desirable city that draws great faculty. It's a liberal arts college, small classes. The students have access to hands-on technology, as I mentioned. And as a result, they end up in a perfect position to be excited about the field, do well on their GREs, have great letters of recommendation, and find their way into top programs to get their PhDs in physics, right? It's not the thing you would have naturally thought of. And as we dig deeper and deeper, there, New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology pops up on there. Carleton, small liberal arts college outside of Minneapolis. Rice University, University of Chicago, again, maybe doesn't surprise you, but Wabash College, all men's college in Indiana, one of just, I think, 4 all men's colleges left. And then you've got Grinnell there, right? Grinnell is a small liberal arts college in the middle of Iowa. Like so in the middle of Iowa that the #1 selling t-shirt in their bookstore says, the students themselves wear it, it's kind of hilarious, it says, "Where the hell is Grinnell?" Right? And Grinnell is a school incredibly wealthy, like per student has a larger endowment than like any of the Ivies. And so Grinnell kind of, unlike Portland, which a lot of people would be excited about, most people aren't quite as excited about Grinnell. So what does Grinnell do? They throw money at the problem. They hire great faculty through paying them. They bring great students in by giving out awesome scholarships. And as a result, they built this wonderful, wonderful community, literally in the Iowa cornfields. You'll hear about them in kind of public, they always do weird stuff. If any of you are sports fans, they'll run really weird offenses in basketball and defenses, and same thing in baseball. If you ever want to Google like Grinnell and baseball, you'll read some of the weirdest configurations for their outfield, and they'll do the same thing offensively, like always leave a man down at the other end and such. But they're better known for non-sports stuff. And then of course Princeton there in the 10th spot. So again, I don't want to sound like I'm belaboring this point of, you can go anywhere, but there are a lot of colleges out there. And the sooner that you grasp that these colleges are doing wonderful things for all sorts of students, the sooner you'll be on a path towards being successful. So we can go to the next slide. Which brings me to this, I don't know who this baby is, I'll totally grab it off the internet. I'm getting towards the idea of fit here. The idea of students needing to find the schools that make sense for them. And probably my greatest kind of way to kind of illustrate this, and I'm swinging a little bit towards highly selective colleges, but I think it'll make sense for everyone. I talk about the student who shows up in my office and says, I want to apply to all the Ivies. And I think to myself, you have no idea what you're talking about, right? And you're not going to do well in this process. Because what that student is telling me is, I'm excited about Columbia University. And Columbia University has a core curriculum. That's a curriculum where all students for 2 years take essentially the kind of the same, not necessarily same classes, but thematically the same classes. And that's great. They want that kind of particular focus, very broad, kind of broad-reaching curriculum. And then that same student is excited to be at Columbia, is now telling me via, I want all the Ivies, I want Brown University. Brown University has an open curriculum, totally unconstructed. Take as many classes as you want and whatever you want, you're gonna graduate. You then compare that kid who's excited about, okay, I'm like, all right, so you want the construction that Columbia offers and the kind of unconstruction that Brown offers. And then you're also, so I'm kind of like, okay, well, you're thinking about your education, but now you're telling me you want Penn. Great school. Penn is often known as the pre-professional Ivy. It was founded by Ben Franklin, one of the most pragmatic Americans ever, right? And they had, until a few years ago, they had an essay question that asked, you know, of our professors, which professor of ours do you want to study with and why? And a kid at age 16, 17, 18 would have to write a 250-word essay. You have to be that laser-like focused at that age to tell them why you wanted to be at Penn. That doesn't feel like a Brown student to me in a lot of ways, right? I'm not saying there isn't an argument to apply to both of them, but I do wonder about the students who just kind of throw them both on the list. And the kid is excited to be at Penn in one of kind of America's great urban centers. You know, the kid who wants to go hear a great DJ at 2 o'clock in the morning and then get burritos at 5 o'clock in the morning, which happens in cities. I know, terrifying to the parents, but you get to do that at a place like Penn. Is that same kid excited to go to Dartmouth? Kind of in the middle of nowhere, up in New England. And also Dartmouth is really, really small. It's almost a liberal arts college in many senses. And the student who wants that kind of intimate community is really excited about Cornell, which is about 4.5 times larger. Like, so size, I guess, in this case, you're not really paying attention to whether you want big classes or small classes, like what kind of community you want. And those same kids who'd be plenty happy to be in Hanover or Ithaca and the very small communities they bring, now want to be in Manhattan at Columbia University. Columbia has an essay question that asks, in the past 2 years, which plays, musicals, museums have you seen visited? Right? They don't really care if you've seen Hamilton or Cats or whatever, right? They're not taking stock of that. They want to know that you're the kind of student who's going to hop on the one line and haul down to Times Square and buy half-price tickets on a Friday afternoon. Because those are the kind of students who are going to thrive being in the heart of New York City. If you're the kind of kid who's like, yeah, I haven't done any of those things, I'm in my room on my computer programming, that's fine, there's a school for you. Columbia would just argue, we're not the place. We want kids who are going to kind of leave their dorms and get out and explore what the city has to offer. So, continuing on with the kind of getting you to start thinking deeper, I know one of the things that a lot of folks can get caught up with, I mentioned earlier, US News and World Report, those rankings, and I've seen it where, you know, a lot of folks just, you know, anything in the top 20. And I'm like, well, what do you mean top 20? Oh, next slide, sorry. There's a bunch of different rankings out there, and I encourage you, don't get caught up in this idea that a school ranked at this level is better than a school ranked at that level. I encourage you to kind of make these rankings work for yourself. There's a whole bunch of different rankings put out by different media outlets. In fact, US News and World Report, it started off as a magazine, and it no longer even exists as a magazine. I don't know if people know that. It's now, the magazine itself is completely gone. It now just exists as a website that ranks stuff and occasionally publishes articles around it. So again, I'd have a little dose of cynicism that it becomes a little bit hard to sell access to your website if the rankings stay the same every year. So every year they tweak a little bit just to move one school up to 3, one up to 1, so on and so forth. So start your research, and next slide. And so this process really starts for me, for students at College-Wise. We really want students to start digging in deeper, and one of the first things that we talk to students about is what makes you happy. There are a lot of students out there who I know it sounds really, really basic, but they don't give much thought to what they want out of their college experience. Over there on the left, that's actually what Tufts application looked like. I think it was in 1936 or 46, where basically if you knew Latin and Greek at a certain level, you were going to get in, right? It's obviously changed. This is one of their essay questions this last year, what makes you happy? And I know even those of us as adults, we would probably struggle with that particular conversation, but I think it's important for students to start asking those questions. So one resource that I might point students towards regardless of what grade you're in, I would encourage you to get on the College Board's website called Big Future. It costs no money. And you can set up basically your own online profile, and they've got a section here which has a bunch of questions that you guys can start chattering about, whether it's on, over the dinner table conversation, on a road trip, whatever it might be. It starts forcing students to start asking questions, parents to start thinking about what they want for their students. And the reason that I think asking these questions is important, when you sit down, when students show up in my office or one of my colleagues' offices, we ask a lot of those questions. And we're often struck that, to the point where one of my friends came up with this kind of made-up acronym. It's not really pronounceable, but it stands for mid-size urban schools with great school spirit. Because what we found was about like 90% of our students came in saying, yeah, I'd like kind of a school that's not too big, not too small. I definitely want it to be in a city, and yeah, I want there to be, I want football games to go to. And I would find myself going, well, do you, I feel like I know you, do you go to your high school's football games? No, I haven't gone to any. I'm like, well, why do you want to come? Well, and what you come to find if you're a college counselor and you've been doing this for a while and you're asking the right questions, even something like school spirit, it doesn't actually mean anything in terms of the college search process. Yes, for some of my students, absolutely. The idea of putting on face paint, wearing the exact same clothing as, all of your, dorm mates, heading out to the tailgate parties, whatever it is, that's what you want from your college experience. But what I've also learned is, most of the time, as we dig a little bit deeper, what most 17, 18-year-olds who are heading out on this grand adventure, what they want a sense of community, that they're not in this alone and on an island. And even small liberal arts colleges in the middle of nowhere provide that for a lot of students. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the colleges Amherst and Williams. Maybe someone went there. Two small liberal arts colleges in Massachusetts, and they have a rivalry that's every bit as fierce as the one between Stanford and Berkeley, or Ohio State and Michigan. I've actually have a few friends who went to Amherst, and they will show, the game is now broadcast on ESPN every year, and I will go to a bar in Los Angeles, and there will be hundreds of people from these podunk little schools, great schools, but they are cheering on their teams just like they went to the University of Texas, or like the Alabama and Clemson folks are doing right now as we speak, right? And so, same thing with urban. You dig a little bit deeper, well, why do you want to be in an urban school? I want to hear music, well, I want to be able to go to concerts. Well, you know what, even if you go to a school in the suburbs, Saturday night, when so-and-so is playing, you will be able to get on a train and find your way there. And not to do any kind of stereotype, but there'll often be, I'll talk to young women who are like, well, I know it sounds frivolous, but I really like to, be able to shop and like kind of be out at malls and things of that sort. Okay, that's fine, but you know what? They're not just in cities, or you'll have easy access to them. And definitely the idea of mid-sized, that's something where every time, if I ask a student, do you think a college that is 5,000 students sounds big to you? Some students will actually be like, that sounds huge. And then I'll say, well, what do you think about 25,000? They're like, that sounds even huger, right? That these numbers don't mean much. You have to start digging past that and asking questions and thinking about what you want for yourself. Another factor that I think a lot of families don't consider until the end is they don't think about the money aspect until the end. Like, we'll figure it out towards the end. And I can tell you from experience, that's the wrong way to approach it. Nowadays, we have a lot of great resources on the internet, which will allow you to determine even before you apply now. And there's a lot of changes here. I won't get into what's called prior year, but you're going to be able to kind of have a sense of whether you can afford a college before you even apply. And so I won't go through all of these websites, but I do encourage you to poke around yourself. I will note, for example, as a college counselor, maybe one of my top pet peeves is when someone says, we can't afford college. There's no way we can afford college at the cost it is. Well, then I think about the Western Undergraduate Exchange. And that is a program where the state of California partners with a lot of other schools in the West, Utah, Nevada, Washington, Oregon, Arizona, where depending on the schools, depending on the majors you're interested, which campus, you can go to a school and you will pay in-state tuition plus 50%. And so at places like University of Utah and New Mexico, that means getting to go to one of their campuses is often cheaper than a Cal State University. And some of them work out to be even less than that. Like Utah, after 1 year, you're considered like an in-state resident and you just pay in-state tuition altogether. So when someone says, oh, college is unaffordable, there's no way we can afford that, oftentimes that's code for USC won't give us a full ride. How could we possibly afford that, right? It's not. College is affordable. You just have to do the hard work and dig around and find the resources. And again, I don't want to be glib because I mean it's a serious thing, but college is affordable. All right, next slide. The other thing students need to do, you need to ask questions of the college. These colleges do not exist if it's not for you guys, for the students, right? So everything is on the table. This is a great resource. The link isn't, one thing that I can do, should have thought of this earlier, on the back table, there's like a little yellow page. If you pick that up and you fill that out at the bottom, if you say you want a copy of the PowerPoint, I can email this to you guys and you'll have all the links and all that stuff. But this is from a guide that the University of Indiana put out on how to kind of visit colleges. And it really gets students thinking about more than just like, do you guys have fraternities here? Right? It gets you digging into like, well, are most of the classes here paper-based, or do we fill out like multiple choice questions, or do I write essays? Like what's going on here? And I think that's a great resource for a lot of students. The other great way to learn about schools, and this is one of the great things, many great things living in Southern California, you have so much access to so many different kinds of universities. I mean, just within the LA area, in the span of just 2 days, you'd have the opportunity to see a great Catholic university in Loyola Marymount. You'd have a chance to see one of the great public universities, UCLA. You'd get to feel what an urban research university feels like with USC. You could see what a small liberal arts college feels like with Occidental. And that's just in 2 days, just there in LA. And I bring this up only because we're at that point, all of us as counselors, we're starting to talk to our younger students, the sophomores and juniors, about spring break visits. And there'll be students who are like, dude, you gotta help me talk my mom into letting me visit a UVA or University of Texas, Austin. And something will tell me, I'm not sure those schools are the right idea for you. And do me a favor, go visit UCLA. Oh no, man, I totally wanna get out of LA. Don't make me visit UCLA. I'm like, just go visit. It's right here, right? 15 minutes away. All right, fine. So they go off, they visit UCLA, they come back to my office, and I ask them, so what was that visit like? And they're like, yeah, it was nuts, It was 2 hours long. I had this awesome tour guide, and he was super outgoing and friendly and funny, but it was nuts. For 2 hours, we walked around that campus, and we didn't run into a single person he knew. I would never want to go to a college like that where I'm just a number. All right, well, tell me more about how UT Austin or University of North Carolina will fit the bill. And then the flip side of that is there's always students I talk to who are interested in, and this is to pick on the boys now, there'll always be some boy who tells me, oh, I want to study philosophy at a liberal arts college in New England, and I picture them like wanting to read Thoreau and Emerson like on some lake, And I'm like, all right, do me a favor, go visit Oxy. The same protest, I don't want to stay in LA. I'm like, just go visit. They come back, they're like, yeah, this awesome outgoing guide, and it was an hour long, and every 3 minutes someone was interrupting him going, hey, will I see you at the newspaper editors meeting? Hey, will you be at the fraternity party? Hey, will you be at intramural soccer practice? Like, I don't want to go to a college where people are up in my business like that. Okay, well, what do you think is going to happen at a Bowdoin or a Middlebury or whatever it might be? So get out here first and visit some of the local universities. It'll save you a lot of time and energy and even money if you first consider things from a local perspective. here are some resources that I like as far as like researching specific schools. Probably my favorite, if I had to pick one, is probably the Fisk Guide to Colleges. I just happen to like the way they write about stuff, but my favorite other book is Princeton Review's Best 378. So pick up one of those books. I think it's nice to just kind of have a chance, to start flipping through and learning more about these schools. And then those websites also do a nice job sharing school profiles and things of that sort. Next page. And then I think the other thing that I want resource that I want to point everyone towards that I think is hugely valuable, a lot of anxiety in this process comes from not knowing what's coming up next, not knowing what's around the corner. And so I'm a big fan of, again, big futures timelines. Your counselors will be sharing with you when you should be doing what, but this is also a great backup system where once you create a profile, let them know what grade you are. It gives you a pretty clear sense of what you need to be thinking about and when you need to be thinking about those things. And I feel like that goes a long ways towards kind of reducing some of the stress that a lot of folks feel. So, with that, I want to take a few minutes to kind of dive into, because I've talked about a lot of kind of technical and mechanical things here. And I think what gets lost in that sometimes is how personal this process really is, and how you need to think about how personal that process is. This is actually a little clip, if any of you have seen Tina Fey's movie Admission. If you haven't seen it, don't run out, it's not that good. But I do like this picture. And that's really what it felt like as an admissions officer, someone who was that person. In the month of February, I literally, in the dead of Chicago, the sun sets at like 2 o'clock in the afternoon, right? It feels like it's literally dark from November to like July. And that's how you're reading applications, just on and on and on. And I know it's easy, especially here in California, we start talking about, well, how many A through G classes did you take? What's your weighted GPA? What's your this score, that score? It can feel like it's numbers, numbers, numbers. And I just want to remind you, when it comes to the UCs, when it comes to private schools, these applications are far more than being just about raw numbers. Yes, the more selective a school is, the more important those numbers become. But this is a really personal process. As I was an admissions officer, as I read those applications, I would read them from the perspective of, oh man, what would this guy have been like on my fraternity, in my fraternity or on my soccer team? What would she have been like as a lab partner or a volunteer? On the Habitat for Humanity spring break trip. It was personal. It wasn't just some sort of like index I was looking at to go, yes, this kid's in, yes, that student is out. And something else to be aware of, and I think it's often surprising, I had this idea when I was like 17-year-old, like the students in this room, of who an admissions officer was. I always thought it was some like old guy in like a blazer sitting in like some library smoking a pipe, reading my application in judgment of me, right? The reality is, the vast number of admissions officers are recent graduates of the very university they went to, right? I didn't grow up wanting, it wasn't like I'll be an astronaut or a fireman or an admissions officer. You stumble into it, happy accidents led me to it. But I had a great experience. It was fun to be at. It was a fun place to continue to work at. And so the average admissions officer's age, 26, right? They're much closer in age to the student than they are to the parents or the counselors and the teachers, a lot of the adults around you. And that becomes important when you start talking about writing essays and things of that sort. And I think one of my colleagues comes out here later in the year to talk about essays specifically, so those of you who are juniors, you want to keep an eye out on that. So I do want to take a few minutes, if you guys can indulge me, let me go 5 minutes longer. I do want to talk a little bit about, next slide, what we are looking for as we would go through these applications. I say we as if I'm still an admissions officer. But you hear an admissions officer say, oh, we want you to challenge yourself, we want you to do X, Y, Z. Well, what do we really want? And so those of you who are younger, the first thing I want you to really think about is curiosity. Now, how are you engaged in your classes? Are you the kind of kid who asks questions? If you're shy, do you go up to the teacher after class, ask questions to learn a little bit more about the material? Or are you the student who kind of just guts it out by like, how much extra credit are you offering this quarter, right? There's a difference in curiosity. And I will admit, the more highly selective a college is, the more attention we pay to, is this kid get an A through extra credit? Or, dude, that was so cool what you taught us about the Battle of Gettysburg. I've got 2 weeks ahead of me here with Christmas break coming up. Can you recommend any books that I could read? Yeah, I know, it's weird. There are people who read for fun, you guys. And they often get into really selective colleges. So this idea of curiosity, it's something to kind of hold at the front. It doesn't mean that you need to be super stoked about every single one of your classes, but especially those of you who are juniors, it's going to be teachers this year who are writing letters of recommendation for you. And so you want to be engaged. I love the teachers who would say things like, yeah, he got a B in the class because he had an awkward relationship with turning in homework on time. But at the same time, no one asked more interesting questions like him. No one provoked better conversation than him, right? There's value. Teachers love those kinds of students. And again, you don't have to do that in every one of your classes, but think about how are you being curious inside the classroom? And that curiosity, it doesn't have to be just inside the classroom. It can extend beyond that as well. You know, the example I always like to bring up, a few years ago I worked with a kid who I didn't know particularly well. He came to work with us just on essays. And when talking to him, like, so what do you do in your free time? He's like, I don't really do anything. I was like, you don't do anything? He's like, well, I can't. He's like, I work almost 20 hours a week at this hamburger shack. And I was like, well, first of all, that is something. Colleges, I'll admit, we have a weak spot for kids who have real jobs. I'm like, I'm interested. Tell me more. I want to hear more about this. It was only half true because I'm vegetarian, so I could care less about burgers. But he dives in and he's excited. He's like, yeah, man. He's like, and he's a big kid. He's an athlete. He's like, the first day I was in charge of unloading the frozen hamburger patties out of the truck. And I noticed stamped on the side of it, it said USDA approved. And I didn't know what that was. And so he goes on, and I still remember this because it becomes his essay. He went home. I went home and I washed the smell of French fry grease off of my arms. And I started Googling USDA. And so the kid goes on to tell this crazy story. And this was not a kid who was like aspiring to become a farmer or something like that. He cared about eating healthy, but he talks about how he dives in, and we've all been there, you know, where you end up like 3 hours later clicking on links on Wikipedia and you end up all over. He did that. And then he found himself reading books on America's agriculture. Right, agricultural system. And then every once in a while when he had free weekends not consumed by lacrosse, he would go to local farmers markets and talk to the farmers there. He would help them actually unload their own produce, right? And so here was a kid, like he wasn't like president of Future Farmers of America. He wasn't getting any sort of extra credit for it. He just did it because he found it really interesting. It didn't matter where it led for him. And so when he wrote that essay, admissions officers aren't reading it thinking, oh man, we could really use them in our cafeteria. They're reading that thinking, this curiosity, if one of our professors gets a hold of him, it's totally transitive. If they get him as excited about quantum mechanics, maybe he becomes a great physicist. Or if they get him excited about poetry, maybe he starts writing an iambic pentameter, right? That's where curiosity can be. And that happens with A students, it happens with C students. So again, really think about curiosity. Also, you want to think about this idea of passion. And I'll speed it up a little bit. Perfect example of this, I can ask two students, hey, your mom told me you volunteered for Special Olympics this summer. What was that like? One student will tell me, yeah, I did 60 hours. The lady signed a letter for me. Do you want to see it? And then I can ask another student, oh yeah, I don't know how many hours I did, but I met this kid named Dave on the first day. He had cerebral palsy. He introduced me to his two best friends who had Down syndrome, and the four of us worked on the 100-meter dash all summer. We worked on the long jump and the high jump, and it was so cool, and I got to know him really well. I went to one of their birthday parties, and in fact, I got invited to be a full-time intern next year. How cool is that? But I don't know how many hours I got. Should I find out? What's the difference in passion, right? So think about it, students. How do you spend your free time? Are you doing it because it's just something you do just to do because it'll look good? Well, I can be honest with you, when it comes to writing the essays or doing well in an interview, it'll never look as good as you hoped it did, just because you thought it would. Versus, I've watched kids who are obsessed with video games, who have turned that obsession and leapfrogged off of that to kind of learn about neuroscience, or dive into graphic design, or turn towards programming computers. I've watched girls who love fashion design turn towards merchandising and marketing and learning how to design themselves. Anything can be a passion, and really think about ways that you can take the things that you do and do more of it. Next slide. Oh, sorry, you can slide past it, yeah. Oh, the one before? Sorry. Yeah. Obviously, last second edition there, but I do want to highlight, we're in January now. I've watched, we're surveying all of our students at College-Wise, where they got in, who got in, why they got in, why they didn't get in. And you see time and time again, the students who are successful in these early decisions, early action applications, they were kids who had a bit of swagger. They were kids who, when they wrote their essays, didn't have essays that say, please let me into USC. When I was 2 years old, my grandfather gave me a USC pillow and I slept on it every night since. That's not a good enough answer. The kid who says, you have an amazing environmental studies program, and when I tie that in to your minor in Spanish and do your study abroad program in Latin America, well, then I can study developmental world economics. That's a kid who's not writing an essay that's like, please let me in. You can see the claw marks of desperation on the essay. And the other kids that we're seeing getting in, they're the kids who are authentic. They're the kids who kind of heard the kind of advice that I just shared, and they've allowed that to build a list that's true to who they are. It's not influenced by what other people thought. It's not, well, my uncle really thinks that I should apply to USC, right? It's more about, this is who I am, and this is what I need, and this is how I'm going to build my list. So, anyways, with that, I think we're not going to quite.
Thanks, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? I hate standing in a microphone. I like to move around when I'm talking. Is that cool? Okay, I got 6 minutes. I work for Princeton Review. We do test prep. Okay? Before I talk about test prep, I want to talk about one thing that Arun talked about, because I have a 17-year-old who just got an early acceptance into Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. And the great conversations I had with him last year was choosing what his dream college was. It was going through that process that you talk about, I want this type of school in this type of setting. Because what happens with parents, what happens with students, is they have their list of dream schools. It's the Ivy League, it's UCLA, it's MIT, it's Berkeley, it's Notre Dame, okay? The one stat I'll throw out here for you, if you take all of those schools, add together all of their freshman slots, it's 25,000 spots, okay? There's 40,000 high schools in the United States, okay? There's 40,000 valedictorians. There's more valedictorians than there are spots in those schools. Find the right school for you, not what you think is the right school for you, okay? Find the environment that you want, major you want, and go from there, okay? But to get there, you have to take the SAT or the ACT. Juniors, you should have access to your PSAT scores now. If you haven't looked them up, look them up. Go to collegeboard.com, create your account, get your report, and then go talk to your counselor. They'll tell you how you did, okay? What I'll say about these standardized tests, the ACT and the SAT, colleges don't care. Find one you like, study for one test, okay? Your PSAT is like a practice SAT. If you can, take a practice ACT. See which one you or your student likes better and stick with that. Because, and this is the phrase that I'll use, if I had 45 minutes, I'd have it up on a PowerPoint. A good SAT or ACT score will help you get into a school. Won't get you into a school, it will help you get into a school. A poor SAT or an ACT score will exclude you from being able to get into your school of choice, possibly. Take these tests seriously. Last year at UCLA, there were 92,000 freshmen who applied. 92,000 freshmen, 17% were admitted, 4,000 ended up going. It's highly competitive out there. You have to take these tests seriously. Study for one, SAT or ACT, master it, take it, get into the college. It's important, it's not the be-all, end-all, but it is one of the major components your schools look at. Okay? Now, how do you choose which one is best for you? I'm going to say something that is the Ross Cope opinion here. The SAT for juniors changed this year. The College Board is having some issues getting information out for people who take the tests. For that reason by itself, every student that I talk to, unless there's a compelling reason to take the SAT this year, I'm going towards the ACT. Schools do not care. They're synonymous. They're the same for each school. They will take the SAT or the ACT. Unless there's a compelling reason, strongly consider the ACT. For a lot of us who grew up in California and took the test many years ago, like when I did, we didn't know what the ACT was. More students actually take the ACT this year or last year than they took the SAT. Don't be afraid of it. Schools accept it, and they don't have the issues because the SAT changed the test. Okay? Your counselors are awesome here at the school. Go to them, find out what options are available to you. If you choose the SAT, go talk to them about the free stuff you can get from the College Board through the Khan Academy. It's good stuff. You want to take the ACT. There's good stuff out there that's no cost. There's classes, there's tutoring, there's whatever you want to do. Take advantage of what you have at the school. It's awesome. Okay? But find out what test is going to be best for you and study for it. Sophomores, don't worry about it until the fall. Okay? Juniors, you better get on it. Okay? There's only 7 more tests this year for both the SAT and the ACT combined. If you haven't taken your first test yet or you're not prepping yet, you're behind. Get on it. You do not want to be doing this your senior year. Now, for the juniors and the junior families out here, I came to a presentation in the spring, and one of the things they'll talk about, you'll sit here and you'll hear seniors talk. The most important thing you can do is start your application essays the summer of your senior year, and everybody nods their head and goes, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. And then what happens? Nobody does it. When you hear somebody say that this is a great time to start those essays, it's a great time to start those essays the summer before your senior year. So therefore, in that fall of your senior year, you can worry about applications. Okay, it's 7:14. Avid's going on somewhere else. I don't know what the room number is. If you have questions about test prep options available here in town, go to your counselors. They'll direct you to me, and I'll help you out. Otherwise, take advantage of Marcy and Susan and the rest of the team. They're really, really, really good.
Okay, so Arun and Ross are going to hang out up front to answer any questions you have.